Welcome to the Aspiring Self podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stolo. Today I'm talking with Alistair, Durwin, and Alejandra about the emotional experience of anger. Anger is something I think all of us are pretty familiar with. I don't know anyone who has not had an experience of anger. Even the most enlightened people in the world likely experience anger. Anger is a very natural part of our emotional experience, and yet sometimes we have a tendency to demonize anger. There's this idea that if we're experiencing anger, somehow we're not a good person. We moralize it. We think of anger as a bad thing. In fact, anger can be a very positive thing. The question is what do we do when we're experiencing anger? How do we show up to the emotional experience of anger rather than becoming overwhelmed by the experience of anger? In today's conversation, we really explore the many facets of anger. How can we understand anger as this beautiful well and field of potential? What can it teach us about our past, about our present, about what we deeply want for the future? So take a moment with this podcast, and I would invite you as you're listening to reflect on your own emotional experience. What happens to you when you're experiencing anger? What happens in your body? What kinds of thoughts accompany anger? How do you respond when you're experiencing anger? Or do you find yourself maybe more reacting when you're experiencing anger? I hope today's conversation is enlightening. It certainly was very enlightening for me. So sit back and enjoy. Thank you.
So we're talking about anger today, which I think is an emotional experience that's familiar to a lot of people. I thought it might be interesting to start the conversation kind of working from the end back to the beginning. So my first question for all three of you is, in the course of working with people who were experiencing anger, and just through your own professional development, maybe also through your own personal development, what have you discovered about anger that's most surprising to you, that you didn't really initially think was going to be what anger kind of revealed to you? So maybe we'll just go around and you can share with me what's been most surprising, what's been the greatest discovery about working with people who are experiencing anger, working through your own experience with anger. Maybe we'll start with Alejandra.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Mark. Well, the most interesting finding for me is that whenever people talk about anger, it means something completely different for every person. And that it's so interesting to go into what does that mean for them? How does that look for them? You never really know what are people talking about when they say they are feeling anger. So that makes my work very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance, the idea that, anger isn't one thing. I think some people maybe we have this stereotyped idea of what anger looks like, like it's hulkish, so it has this kind of monstrous quality to it.
Yes, absolutely. There's that, or there is an idea that, for example, like there can be resentment, for example, is like a mild anger that can be perceived or felt period of time, very different from an intense feeling of anger that might show up as seeing red or black. So it's very important to explore what your relationship to anger is as well. So we go there into family history and cultural stereotypes and cultural scripts and gender.
Yeah.
Oh, gender.
Yeah. So how we're socialized around anger, context matters, culture matters. These are all things that are influencing how we understand and make sense of anger. So it's interesting. Yeah. Well, let's come back to that, because I think that's important when we start talking about nuance around the experience of anger. Durwin, what's been surprising for you in your discovery around anger?
Yeah, I think what was surprising, or what's been surprising to me, is how often challenges with what we might say anger out. So anger behaviors or aggressive behaviors, let's just say, that are harming others, is coupled with anger in, which is like the inner critic inside of somebody, that's sort of, belittling them, that kind of thing. And I found that they go together quite often, and more than I would have thought when I first started.
Do you ever see them disassociated? Do you ever see someone manifesting anger who's not having an interior experience of that self-critic, self-judgment, or they're kind of, in your experience, very coupled together?
They don't have to be. Someone may not have much inner critic and just be very aggressive and, maybe have more. But typically I'm finding them often together. And when they're disassociated, then someone might be projecting their anger and just not aware that they're angry, but they find themselves surrounded by angry people, seemingly angry people. And then the process is to kind of re-own, well, you know what, actually I am feeling angry.
Right.
Yeah.
Alistair, what's been surprising for you in all your work with people experiencing anger?
I think the complexity, what's behind it, and that I keep on learning more about that, just around history and things like the impact of unexpressed anger and how damaging that is to our physiology and our immune system, and how it shows up in the body. It's so profound, the impact on people's bodies when anger is not expressed in a healthy way. So often people think that's just holding it in, but it's also expressing it out in a way that's counterproductive, that doesn't resolve anything. And both of those and many more options available, just they have this big negative impact on physical health.
What does it look like sometimes from a physical, like how would that express itself, or have you seen that express itself physically?
Where somebody feels it in their throat, and they're either in a relationship where if they speak, they aren't heard, or they grew up where they didn't have a voice. Whether that's they didn't speak up because it wasn't safe, or when they did speak up, it just, chaos or unpredictability. And I've had people actually lose their voice, have to have surgery, and then change a relationship, and then they get their voice back.
Wow. So
it can be pretty dramatic, but often when people feel a lot of tension in their throat, it means that there's been something going on where they haven't been heard, where they feel powerless, and it doesn't just show up in the throat, it shows up in other places. But I think the longer I do this work, the more I connect with the physiology and do more work around that when that's called for. So
I would think that's I would think that's a pathway into the emotional experience for some people, right? Just tuning into the somatic side of it, the physical side of it, and that sometimes is an entry point, particularly for people who are not used to contemplating their feelings, or maybe just not as tuned into their feelings, but their body is showing those feelings.
Many of us men grow up being trained by our caregivers or society at large to not show any emotion, well, except for maybe anger. Anger can be okay to show at some level, aggression, but not to show the whole range. And then we lose out so much on life. We lose out because if we numb our sadness, we're numbing all sorts of other things as well, so that we don't feel the love or the care as much either. And that really limits ourselves.
Right. Many, you've already started pointing out one thing that I think comes up a lot in the experience of anger, or even discussions around anger, is it's a very polarizing emotion. There's a lot of moralizing of anger. It's right, it's wrong. Um, there's this sense of suppression, expression. It's another polarity that we see with anger, right? Those who are withholding it, those who are overly expressing it. Can we talk a bit about that tension, the polarity? Maybe we'll start on the moral side of the spectrum. Like, is anger right or wrong? Can we maybe help clarify that? Because I think there's a bit of a stigma around anger about its rightness or wrongness. Can we maybe talk about that? And anyone feel free to jump in.
Well, anger is just an emotion, and it's a very important emotion. Because it determines where are our boundaries. So if somebody gets too close to you, or somebody wants to talk about something you're not ready, or somebody criticizes your opinions, you're going to have a little bit of an experience of this is not okay, and you're going to want to express some sort of anger, ideally. And I mean, I say ideally because one of the trauma that can show up in repressing anger is that you freeze and you don't express it, and you try to accommodate to the situation by just repressing your anger. But anger, as a basic human emotion, it's important for our survival. I mean, back in the days, it was very important for our survival when we were, cavemen, cavewomen, prehistoric times. But now it still shows up in the same way to let us know when we're afraid as well, when we are not safe. So somebody says danger is one word, one short letter from anger. So we can feel the threat, and then we want to express our anger. But if the problem is not anger, then the problem is how we relate to it and what kind of the constructive or destructive responses we might have towards it. So I feel like our society is starting to learn more about their relationship with anger. The people that come our way anyways are very curious, and they want to heal those silences, those empty gaps, and put more language into the nuances of anger so that they can have a good relationship with their anger and not go into, black or white, which is what will happen if you have something unresolved and if you're angry.
Yeah. So what I heard you say is, so anger, let's say anger arises, and it arises for most people, right? I personally don't know anyone who doesn't have the experience of anger at some moment. So certainly some, I think, are more sensitive to that feeling, or maybe it's a more commonplace feeling. And what I hear you saying is that so there's no polarization necessary around the experience of anger. Anger is, so to speak, right? It's a part of the emotional spectrum. What we're reflecting on, I think what we're showing up to, is how does one respond to the experience of anger? So now that this experience is arising, what's next, so to speak?
Well, that's the word you used. Respond is pretty key, because whenever people have come to us, and 99% of the time at least, they didn't respond, they reacted. And usually before people come to see us, they haven't been sleeping well. Well, usually there's some sort of big blow up. Not always, but most of the time. And the days, weeks, months prior to that, usually they weren't sleeping well. They were drinking too much or smoking too much weed or what have you. They stopped exercising. They were overly stressed. They were overwhelmed, and their whole physiology was at the edge. And then something else happened and they lost it. And in that moment, the body doesn't know the difference between a physical threat or an emotional threat. The body just senses threat. And so it automatically shuts off the higher reasoning part of the brain, disconnects us from our heart, our emotional intelligence, the intelligence in the body. None of that is necessary for survival. It's just acting as if we're under a physical threat. And so if we've escalated enough, then that's what the body does. And then we react like it's the end of the world. And the more we escalate, the more our emotional maturity level tends to drop. So we end up acting like a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old, maybe,
right.
Probably 2.
more a tantrum. Can you just maybe just also for nuance sake, help our listeners understand the difference between a reaction and a response? What's the difference between those two things?
So the response means that we pause. The reaction means we don't take any time. And that first reaction, anger is the guardian of our boundaries. So somebody crosses our boundaries for the 50th time, and we've been holding all this resentment and frustration, and we just react like we're going to die if we don't react because they just did this or that or said this or that or what have you. Whereas one of the things we do in the first session in our groups, or often if we're in individual work, is we'll go into a lot of the physiology about what's happening in your body, your brain, and all of this stuff. And then we talk about the sensations in the body, and then their homework is, so over the next week, just notice what's happening in your body, what's happening with your thoughts, and do this without judgment, just with curiosity for yourself and others. No judgment, you're just noticing for a week. Most people come back the next week and say, things are better. I mean, not perfect or anything, but things are moving in a good direction because they're noticing, they're taking the time to pause, to think it through, to observe themselves and the other. And when we do that, then we're way more likely to respond. We're way more likely to think it through, to connect to our heart, be aware of our own physiology, and then we're kinder, nicer people and less reactive.
Right. I'd also add that noticing that reacting is always habitual, that it's a past behavior, it's a socialized behavior, it's a pattern of behavior. And the irony of reacting as well, often what I notice is that when people are are angry, you talk about the sense of crossing their boundaries. So something is infringing on them. And that infringement is, let's say, it's also a contravening of their freedom or their sense of freedom, right? Their autonomy, some part of them feels intruded on. And what's interesting about reacting is that it's not really a choice, a reaction. There's no freedom in reacting, in the sense that the person is not deliberating in that moment, to your point, responding. It's just habitual.
They feel awful after the reaction, right, because they acted in a way that's not really who they are.
Right.
Then the shame kicks in, and if we do something healthy with the shame, we connect with our conscience. Well, that's not me. What am I doing? And we choose to face it, to learn from it, to grow, and to, okay, I need to figure this out. Oh, I'm going to go to anger management, and I have to learn, because it feels so awful because it's not true to who we are. And it's good that it feels awful. That's the shame reminding us, that's not cool. Don't do that. That's, and we feel the other thing is we tend to feel out of control when we're really triggered. And if we react, we're reacting in a way that's out of control. Whereas if we pause, then we can be more in control of ourselves. It's like if we react, the other person's in control of us.
One other
Go ahead, Durwin.
No, I was just going to add what I felt in reaction at the mental level is typically, again, sometimes I call it the mind machine of negative judgments. So there's usually some strong judgments of the other person or the situation that go along with the reaction.
Give people an example, Durwin, of that, how that unfolds.
Yeah, maybe I can give an example of one of the ways that I've tried to work with that is a redirection technique of basically expending the energy or fatiguing the muscles when they're activated by doing something like pushing on a wall, but so that you're still, working with the energy of it. So you're not suppressing, but then changing the story at that time to something like, I want to be free of anger, or I want to be compassionate to myself and others, something like that. So we're changing the storyline, but still helping the body deal with the emotion. So
there seems to be like this, I say this, I'm not sure how else to say this, but there seems to be a kind of ease with anger, in the sense of it comes easy. It's like it arises quickly, and then, I mean, the aftermath of anger is hard, I would say. But it seems like anger, when I experience anger, there's a kind of easiness about it. It's this kind of quick and dirty emotion. Like it can just happen. Like the subtext of it is extremely complex, but the manifestation of it itself seems to be very discreet and kind of simple. Do you sense that in working with people with anger?
I worked with an 11-year-old many years ago, and he says to me, anger is like a slide. Once you get started, it's really hard to stop.
Right.
I'm like, you're a genius.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so why is it so slippery? Why is anger such a slippery slope?
And people conflate anger with aggression. So anger is not aggression. Anger is an emotion, and some would argue that aggression is too, but aggression typically is the action.
It's the behavior, yeah.
Right. So we can be angry, and if we're aware of our anger, we can stay connected to the fact that we love the other person. We can even be in tears because we're feeling our hurt because of something they did or didn't do, or what have you. And we can be angry and intelligent, or we just react in the moment and start attacking the other person. So it depends which path you go down. And so part of the work I like to do with people is helping them get clear on what the destructive path is like. We want to be really clear so you notice when you're going down that path, and the more constructive path. What's that all about? And a lot of the time people haven't really noticed those within them. But when you're clear, you can catch yourself sooner when you're going down that destructive path, and pause sometimes for minutes or hours or a day or however long you need, so that you can collect your thoughts and do something wiser with that anger. And sometimes that means writing or talking with somebody else, or going getting some exercise, doing whatever you need to do to gain perspective and to be more yourself when you respond. So the anger, when it's that reactive anger, a lot more often is.
Yeah. Well, it has that cascade. It has that domino cascading effect. So once you're in the throes of it, like that slipperiness that the 11-year-old described is appropriate because it has a kind of gravity to it. It has a strong pull. You see this, fights, they escalate, once that first punch is thrown, it's like, like.
Well, and there can be something good about it, right? Like sometimes people are like, awesome, right? This feels good. At some level, it can feel like you're in control. Really, you're not.
Right.
You're just reacting. But in the moment, our thinking becomes really black and white. And so you can see a little bit of that on social media, that people just get super extreme. and they don't listen to anything the other person says. They just destroy the other person's character, even though there's no intelligence in that. It just, yeah, they become all or nothing.
Alejandra, I think Alejandra wants to.
I think what Alistair is talking about right now is the righteous anger. So righteous anger is that moral kind of justification that I'm entitled to be angry because what you're saying is wrong. So there's that moral quality. But when you talked about, like it's very easy for some of us to go into anger, that would be your preconditioning. It's not like that for everybody. So it's like you have created neural pathways, and maybe this goes back into your family lineage, and maybe the people that were socialized as men in your family lineage were more connected to this quick release that feels really great. And what I found in my work with women is that usually the control that wants to happen in the moment of anger is like an attempt to get things back in control when things are feeling out of control, right? So a lot of men would be like using their anger to kind of like calm things down at home so that they can self-regulate, sort of. So in my experience with working is sometimes our nervous system doesn't have any other capacity to hold anger in a more paused way. And so my work, when I work through somatics, is to create more space to release that anger in a way that is very different from what you might have experienced in the past, in a way that you're not hurting yourself or you're not hurting others. But what usually happens, and this is another finding in my work that maybe Durwin and Alistair have seen also, is that when there has been abuse in the household of a person growing up, and they have been traumatized by somebody else's anger, which was not anger, was abuse, right? People call that anger. Then some people will say, I never want to do that. I will never want to get angry again. And so when they are growing up, they're also repressing it, but it's impossible to repress the anger because it's a natural emotion. So then when it comes out very inappropriately because we don't have the skills. So there's a lot of developmental issues. We get stagnant developmentally when we haven't had the right environment to encourage ourselves to feel and integrate that with what was happening, and then just move through it and know what to do the next time we feel anger. So there's a lot of this mechanism, this defense mechanism or this coping mechanism that we might have had when we were kids, whether that is to express it on somebody else or to repress it. Might become something that is not functional anymore. And that's when the work comes into, okay, there's a learning for this nervous system to express the anger. So I love what Durwin does, because what he's doing when he asks somebody to push the wall, right, or to press a pillow, it's like, okay, we're going to just release the tension without any stories or the usual stories.
Right. The stories I would
safety.
Yeah, I like you talking about earlier. I think it was Alistair who talked about the witnessing, the experience, helping, starting at the place of noticing, mindfully noticing the experience. And I think I want to explore that a little bit because I think that's an uncommon Obviously, that notion has been more explored with mindfulness-based practice and kind of the greater attention being placed on mindfulness-based practices. But it's not a commonplace notion for most people, in the sense that most people are lost in their emotional content rather than presence with that emotional content. Why is the noticing so important? Like, what's the difference between the rapture of the emotional experience and just being completely lost in it, and the noticing side? Maybe we can just contrast those two states, or those two ways of relating to anger.
I can jump in there if nobody else is going to.
Sure.
So a lot of the time, people aren't aware of the sensations that are going on in their body, especially men. But once they become aware, it's like they're able to sort of step back and observe more. Right? Some will feel it in their legs, or it'll start in their belly, or often it's in their chest. There's often that's fear in their solar plexus. Often there's shame, power, and powerlessness right there. The throat, but often the jaw, right, grinding our teeth, gritting our teeth. And when people notice this, it helps them be more connected to their body, but then they can be more aware that there is this emotion in them. And we breathe differently with each different emotion, because each emotion inhabits our body differently. Often sadness or grief or loss is a weight up and down, the core of your body. And most of them have an impact on your breathing. Like sometimes people will feel like there's an elephant sitting on them, stepping on them. And the overwhelm is often up here. And just noticing and being aware of all of this, often for men, they've been very alone with their angry or their shame after they've reacted. And this connects them. At the end of the first session of the group, somebody always says, well, and they're looking around, and it's just a bunch of regular guys. And for the most part, just a bunch of regular guys. Somebody will say, well, it's good to know I'm not the only one. I'm not alone.
Right.
And that has a profound impact on people. And then they're connecting and being more aware. Then they have, it's data. So they have more access to the knowledge, that's the wisdom that's in their body. And there's this feedback loop between the brain and the body. And it goes back and forth. So if I'm sitting with a client, talking with them, and I notice that my breathing is shallow, I'll ask them how their breathing is, because often it's a reflection of their breathing. It might just be mine too, but
right.
More often when I ask, their breathing is shallow, and then we can talk about that. Or if somebody feels it a lot in their jaw, I'll sometimes do a very simple somatic exercise, which is to open and close your jaw as slowly as possible. And sometimes all sorts of emotion will come up with that. Sometimes not so much, but depends on the person and the moment. But we have access to so much if we stop and connect. And then we become more self-aware, and we can make more choices along the way rather than reactions.
Yeah. People talk a lot about the relationship between fear and anger. What's the dynamic there between fear response, the anger response? Is there fear always below the surface of anger? Can anger kind of exist on its own without the presence of fear?
Somebody else.
Durwin, you want to go at that?
Sure. Yeah, because I know a little bit about anxiety as well from my own experience. So, yeah, I would say not necessarily. I do find the personality model of the Enneagram helpful. As kind of a quick and dirty overview of like head types that tend to have a little more issues with anxiety, heart types or image types that feel more jealousy or envy or want to keep their image or feel shame. That's a very social type. And then the gut types who have anger as a kind of primary go-to emotion under stress. So certainly for head types, I feel that the anxiety and the anger often can go together. So a little bit connected to personality, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be that boundary setting feeling, coming up.
What's your sense, Alejandra, in your practice to help understand the relationship between fear and anger? Are they coupled? Are they not necessarily coupled?
I think when anger is the protector, when anger is not the primary emotion, we can find that we're feeling fear, shame, sadness, loss. All these things underneath the anger. So sometimes anger will show up because it doesn't feel safe for us to contact those emotions. When one of the biggest, more rewarding pieces of my work is when I work with the trigger. So you might find yourself having a disproportionate response to an event, and that event is just the trigger. So when we go into the body, to the somatics of what's happening for them in that moment, there's usually a connection to a younger age. And the trigger is the experience on the younger age. And so we go healing these moments and updating them to, cognitively, the adult that we are, how could we respond with compassion to that younger part of us? And younger, I mean, even like if that was 5 years ago, it doesn't matter how old or young you are. And so by doing that work, the next time you'll feel the fear or the anxiety, you can feel various emotions and not only one. And that will allow you to have more capacity to respond. Yeah. So that's kind of the healing piece, that it's so fascinating because, you will go to many different places with people that they didn't even knew that it was there.
Right.
And so it takes off the pressure of the actual situation, and it puts actually the power in your hands.
It sounds like a lot of you are getting at the idea that anger is kind of a field of potential in a way. Let's say sometimes a disintegrated field of potential. Like it doesn't quite make sense, but it's this energetic force. It's laden with complexity. It holds these mysterious doors that are unvisited. It's a conduit to the past. It says something about the nature of self. It reveals pathways to future. Let's talk about anger as this field of potential, because again, to just kind of destigmatize this idea, because even the notion of anger management, it's in itself comes with certain mores. Like, okay, I'm fully managed now. I've been, the robot is corrected. I'm ready to be back in the world, so to speak. Because I think what you're doing is important. Like you're trying to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to anger. So you're trying to authentically show up to this experience that this person is having. So let's talk about this idea that anger is a field of potential. What's the potential that resides inside the experience of anger?
So sometimes people will will say to me when they learn, what I do for work, say, well, how do you deal with all those angry guys?
Right.
Judgment
Right.
and I'll say, well, most of the time when people come to me, they're not actually angry. They're feeling shame.
Hmm.
And something terrible's happened and they want to change. They are really motivated. This is not true 100% of the time, but most of the time they're motivated and they're like, this is not my life. This is not who I am. And I want to figure this out. So the anger has led them down a path that's, now it's motivating them. I really want to understand how I ended up in this place, because it doesn't feel right. So I've been running this business for 28 years because I've got to see so many people create amazing changes in their lives. Not everybody, but I just tell people, when people come and they're motivated and they put time and effort in, like anything else in life, you keep on putting time and effort in, and you read our book, other books, and you keep on working on this, you're going to get somewhere really good. And most people find that they end up, when they have success, they end up feeling more like themselves. We're not trying to mold them into some sort of robot. It's like your job is to become true to who you are and act more like that person rather than your history. Even previous generations of trauma can have an impact on you now. So yes, we're going to look at the past, but we're only going to look at it how it shows up in you right now in this moment, because that's what matters. And so we see people become, kinder and nicer, and sometimes they feel worse than ever because they lost it again. But I say that's great that you feel worse than ever, because that means you're really feeling it, right? The shame is hitting home, and we learn in our core of our body. We don't intellectually. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are in the world. It's irrelevant if you don't connect with, like, the learning always seems to happen in the body, and something shifts in us, and all of a sudden we get it. Often because we develop some compassion or empathy, and we feel the impact on the other person, and then we feel awful. That motivates us to change, to be more in alignment with that. And often when people come, they've been really escalated and burnt out, and when they bring that back down into a healthier level, we need stress, but not too much. Then the people around them is like, oh, nice to have you back. And so that, I'm pretty grateful to be able to witness that often.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a kind of like coming home. Sounds like a lot of people show up in this experience with a sense of disconnection to self, also manifesting as disconnection to others.
Yes.
Defensibility, unoffensibility. There's a lot of othering, polarizing, right? So things at odds with themselves, and then this kind of coming home to something that's below the surface. And the shame sounds like the experience or that sense of disconnection. Like I'm out of tune with something that's closer to home. And the shame is kind of an indicator that I'm out of tune with that.
Right. And we feel the shame, and then we can do something healthy with it. If we face it, if we own it, step into some humility, compassion for self, for others, or we do something really toxic with it and start blaming and judging, criticizing, and we go down that path. And all of us do both. And so it's about getting to know how that shows up for you and how it's showed up in your family history. But most families won't talk about the shameful events that have happened in their family history, or if you try, it's going to be a disaster.
Right.
I know, I tried.
Do you sense there's something going? Do you sense there's something going on? So we talk culturally about polarization, and there's the kind of increasing divide between people, right, left, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. There's a million one of these polarities. What's that? What's going on there that relates back to our experience of anger? Why is there this sense that people are, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but in the conversation around polarization, why is there the sense that people are growing apart and becoming angrier at each other? And in a way that's becoming socially normative. We're talking about, like, we're having this conversation like this is just what's happening, so to speak. We're all just learning to dislike each other. What's going on there? Why is this phenomenon seeming to show up more and more intensely at a cultural level? What does that say about people's experience around anger?
Well, I
the
can
word
share.
hate comes up when you say that. It's not just dislike each other. It's like,
and I can talk about needs after you, Alejandra.
Yeah, each one of you maybe will tackle that. Like, let's go to Alejandra, and then we'll go to Durwin and come back to
I had a brilliant teacher when I was studying family therapy. We were studying the history of violence in Colombia. And this guy was a mediator, a brilliant psychotherapist as well. And he said, the story of violence in Colombia started inside the families, when we started to point each other like, you're red and you're conservative. So that said so much about the lack of tolerance. And I don't really love tolerance because it's like I barely tolerate you, but I would say it's more about learning how to be in dialogue. It's so important so that we don't cut dialogue. But in order for there to be dialogue, there needs to be like two windows that are open. One of the windows is shut down. There cannot be any dialogue, and there can be an intrusive, a monologue. So it's a lot about how to talk respectfully and how to maintain dialogue with people that are different than us. But that can be impossible when we are under certain circumstances. Like, there's a lot of social experiments, right? What happens when we are in groups? We get more polarized. And also the same that we use for our work, we have something called the arousal cycle, which is based on the window of tolerance. And basically, when we are, if this is a bell curve and we are up here and we're super escalated, we just can't have a productive conversation. And that's the moment when we want to take what I call a time in, not a time out, because like, oh, we're grounded. It's like a time in to go back to a sustainable place for me, so that I can have a conversation when I'm not going to dissolve our relationship completely, at least. So we want to maintain those channels open, but in some contexts, like the internet, might be impossible. Right. In some forums. Durwin.
Yeah, I just want to add to that before we get to Durwin, is when you mentioned the internet. Yeah, the context matters. So you talk about tolerance, patience. There are some environments that are not conducive to those values, virtues, orientations. So, the internet's not a patient place, so to speak. It's a lot of instant exchange. Right. So yeah, so it's not like take a few moments, take a day and comment on that. No, it's like I can comment instantaneously. There's low levels of accountability. this
Yes.
conversation is moving at a mile a minute, and so I'm kind of in a reactive mode, and so the conversations tend to be very stratified, very tension ridden, because the medium and the metaphor are aligning such that there's a lot of anger bubbling up and a lot of polarizing.
Correct. And when you're on sympathetic charge, you don't want to stop. You want to push the accelerator even more. You want to get it done. You want to say everything you think. You feel like you're in an enlightened place and the other one's wrong and you have it very clear.
Right.
And so that is not the positive energy of anger. The positive energy of anger is life energy, but that is not life energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, when we're coming back to ourselves, means that we can feel the life energy and we can hold it in a way that's compassionate towards others.
Yeah. When you said that, it made me think of the difference between like sucking the oxygen out of the room or bringing more oxygen into the room. And there's something in those kinds of exchanges where the person who feels that they're right, feels that they're just, is trying to suck as much oxygen out of the space, and they just want to oxygenate themselves. And you feel that creates a kind of vacuum effect of sorts.
Correct. That's why we don't have, some people call us, we have those kind of rooms where you go and break stuff.
Right. Rage rooms. Yeah, maybe social media needs just a space where people can kind of evacuate and then come back to exchange. I don't know. But,
little kids desperately need attention from their parents. And if they don't get positive attention, they'll do something negative. Whatever they can do to get attention. And when I think about the internet, I think, okay, the person's operating at about a 2-year-old level. And if they say something completely outrageous, they get so much attention and so much outrage, which is why there's so many trolls. They're just like, hey, I can get like a million people reacting now, and I feel completely powerless in my life. And this feels powerful.
Right.
It isn't really powerful. It's empty, but that's the reward.
Yeah. And it's, again, it's conducive because the spatial orientation of the internet is by definition a way you're not being seen, right? There's no body language, there's no presence, there's no psychospatial, psychosomatic accountability. You're almost a non-entity in a way. So it probably even turns up the volume. Yeah, exactly. There's all caps, and then there's emoticons, and so it turns up the volume on the necessity to be noticed. It's like, because if you were acting out the way you presented yourself on the internet in front of people, you would probably be deeply embarrassed in a way. Like it would be very clownish almost in a way. It would be socially awkward. But on the internet, everything needs emphasis. Like everything needs an exclamation point or a double emoji or all caps because there's no other vehicle for me to communicate. Durwin, you wanted to add something to that?
Sure. Well, I think that anger and technology and anger and politics are both really interesting questions, and they're a little outside my clinical day-to-day. So I wanted to just go back a little bit to the idea of the potential of anger. And potentially anger is a signal of an unmet need. Alistair just mentioned need for attention. So sometimes I explore that with people. Anger could be telling you, not again, aggressive behaviors, but the feeling of anger or frustration could be telling you that you've had unmet needs for a while. And then I use that to open up a conversation about needs, starting right from square one with core attachment needs that we all have, which are mostly pre-verbal. We act them out more than have them as a thought process.
Some examples of that, like Alistair mentioned the need for attention, some other needs, for example, that
felt safety. So feeling physically safe at the very fundamental physical level. Feeling seen and known, which is the need for emotional attunement. Feeling comforted. Are our parents able to soothe us and reassure us when we're upset? Feeling valued. so we're not a burden. They like having us as their kid. And support for our best self, which is that need. Once we feel secure, then we tend to want to go explore. There's that kind of back and forth between secure base then exploring the world. So we need support to go for it as well. So those are 5.
Yeah. It's this very beautiful knotted ball anger. It's bound by so many different things. There's a deep desire in it. There's a deep wish in it. There's deep needs in it. It feels sometimes like it's almost hiding a jewel that's bound by. And I think there's something wonderful in that. There's that welcomes a conversation around anger that's different than, let's call it, a more conventional conversation where, again, we demonize anger, and anger is intrinsically bad, so to speak. And if we were all free of anger, I don't know, we would be floating on cloud tops. I don't know what that would look like, but right. It'd be Xanadu. I don't know. So I think that's important. I think it's important that we share the message that anger holds kind of an important kind of information in it for you as a person. It's inviting something to look at, explore, understand more deeply. And that's, I think one of you said, I think it was Alistair said earlier, in that spirit of curiosity, something opens. And it sounds like a lot of your work is inviting people to simply be curious with the emotional experience when no one's ever invited that, because they probably have felt only shame and frustration and disappointment around anger. I assume many come to you and they're with a certain kind of self-hatred. I'm an angry person. I'm a terrible person. I'm awful. Everyone else tells me I'm awful because I'm angry all the time. Just inviting that place of self-compassion and curiosity must be incredibly freeing for people.
I would like to interject there.
Yeah, sure.
Because the people that come and see me are nothing like what you mentioned.
Okay.
So I need to.
Sure.
Yeah. Like people that come to see me, and I do the women's group, so I'm going to focus on my clients, my individual clients, and the women that are in my group. They're usually very successful in most areas in their life, and anger is just showing up in one relationship with one of their kids, or they're going through a breakup, and or they come because of work and they want to be more successful at dealing with people, more assertive. So it's really interesting that most of my clients are highly productive people that are perfectionists. And some of them, the ones that feel more shame about anger, are the ones that have not been able to contact anger at all because they've been with a partner that has traumatized them and they want to feel their power. So I was thinking of, in this ideal world, how could anger potentialize our relationship? How beautiful it is when me and Alistair can just be very, very, very strong, and just like we're partners. Okay. So for the people that don't know this, Alistair and I are partners. And so what it means for Alistair to say no or stop, and what it means for me to have the same capacity to do the same stop, no, and how that is so powerful and so beautiful. So those boundaries also create the potential of solving issues and find new ways of solving conflict. So I just wanted to share that, the stereotype of angry people that come to see us has nothing to do with reality.
Right. Yeah, I think it comes back to your original point, which is that anger shows up in a multitude of ways.
Yeah. In a world without anger sounds really boring.
Right. Well, it sounds like because if we understand anger as a kind of energy, it's an energetic force. There's a deep wisdom in the body and in the mind. It's these are not aberrations. They're in service to something. Again, the way we talk about anger sometimes, the way we socialize around anger, I think it casts a shroud around anger in a way that might be unhelpful. But I think one thing that I've heard very clearly from all three of you today is that there's deep revelation in anger. There's something in it that it can be also a wise teacher.
Yes.
And we understand that anger can also boil over, and it can certainly be deeply disruptive in people's lives, or it can be so suppressed that it can be deeply disruptive in people's lives. That doesn't mean that just because it shows up that way, that again, it can be understood as a field of potential. And while it dances in a multitude of ways and it flickers in a multitude of ways, it's still, there's a light in it. There's an energy in it that holds some truth. If we look at it with a certain quality of looking, which is I think what you're inviting a lot of your clients to do, is to look at it again for the first time, so to speak, see it anew. Sorry, Alejandra, you wanted to add something?
Sorry for interrupting. And okay. I had to pause because my internet went unstable, so I wanted to take care of that. Just wanted to go back to the anger management tradition because I also don't like that name. I don't want to be ungrateful for the tradition because, we've learned from anger management, but I don't think that it would be a great name for 2023. I think we don't want to manage. We don't want to change behaviors. We want to really do like a resolution. We want to address it integrally in an integral way, relationships, in relationship to your family of origin, of your culture, spiritually, in every single way. And just wanted to say that because anger management sounds like I wouldn't want to do that. That's not what we do. And also, I wanted to say, I forgot the second piece, but
we'll come back to it. Yeah, I appreciate that.
We've talked about changing the name, but most people, when they call, they're looking for anger
management. Yeah, I get the doorway in, but I also hear what Alejandra is saying, that this idea, I need to be managed. I mean, there's like, you're going to manage me? Like, for some people who are expressing anger in a certain way, just that idea would evoke a certain tension for them. Like, I don't want to be managed. You're not going to manage me. I don't, I don't need to be babysat.
Right.
Yeah.
Or I need to manage my anger. And it's not like that. It's like, I want to explore my relationship with anger. I want to have a relationship with my anger so that when it shows up, I'm not freaking out, but I'm like, hi, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think that's so important because that comes back to the react to respond. How do I be in because people, again, there's this idea of like, if I'm getting anger, I'm in control. No. You're not in control because you're reacting. You're not in control. You're performing something out of some kind of habit, but you are not in control. Control, so to speak, is learning to be in relationship to this experience, not being overwhelmed by this experience. Because when you're overwhelmed by anger, you are the furthest place from control. You're about at the other end of the spectrum but the illusion is that I'm in control. Right? The illusion is that by holding this thing, but you're actually squeezing the life out of it in a way. It's like you're squeezing so hard to it that literally everything that's powerful in it is actually seeping out on the edges. I think that's a really important. So I like this idea of talking about how do I transform my relationship to anger? Not how do I get rid of it? Not how is it managed? It sounds like you put it into a box and it gets stored in your closet. Now it's fully managed. Or you're a light switch, it's on or it's off. And if it's on, if it shows up, now I'm a terrible person again. And I'm sure you deal with that yo-yo effect, right? Oh my God, I had anger today. I'm awful. And I think you're hinting or you're really explicitly saying there's a very different way of us understanding how we can relate to this other sphere of our emotional experience. And when it shows up, it's inviting us to notice something. And being curious with that is healthy and makes perfect sense. And there's a wisdom in that anger. So what is it inviting us to notice? And when you don't notice and you're reacting, you're not learning. You're performing. You're in reaction. You're in habitual response. And then invariably shame comes up because again, you're performing a pattern that has traces of the past, unresolved feelings. So it's interesting, like the kind of being a bit summarical about the conversation.
There is also the sacred rage, which I think that Dr. Edith, what's her name? Edith Eger? Somebody help me out. She's Jewish. She talks about sacred rage, and I think that is a very beautiful concept, because sometimes when we've been through a horrible experience in our life, we may have like a ceremony when we are kind of like burning the rage to its core for whatever happened to us. So I think that we need to honor our anger and look at what is trying to point us towards the wound that it's hurting. And if our society if each of us will do that work, I think we would just be healing massively into even our politics, because everything is politics, even the personal is. So yeah, I'm sure that if we all take care of ourselves, we would be doing great work to our environment and to our community.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think there's something to be said for environments being able to hold these emotional experiences as well. Whether it's a workplace, certain systems, how are we holding space for people having emotional experiences? It's a kind of it's a dialogue between the individual and the environment, back and forth. Maybe as a final leave behind, if maybe invite each of you, if you were inviting people to inquire into anger in their experience, can you suggest some simple way that someone could invite a quality of inquiry into the experience of anger? Maybe we'll go the other way around. We'll start with Durwin, then Alistair, and then end with Alejandra.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd maybe try reframe something like anger leadership or anger self-leadership, something like that, in terms of shifting from the anger management mindset.
What would that inquiry look like for someone? So if you were giving them like a very practical inquiry, let's call it an exercise or an experience, what would that look like?
That's another good question. I think I just coming up with the anger leadership was my but if they're open to it, it could be, exploring it in a parts kind of way. If they resonate with parts, then seeing the parts of them that, I often see, again, the inner critic, like an inner punitive adult part, then the child that's being criticized. This is all internal, anger type stuff. And then the self-leadership being sort of a deeper kind of core self that can kind of navigate between those. Something like.
So noticing the inner critic, and then kind of
the criticized, who the critic is criticizing, which is often vulnerable childlike adolescent part.
And then if I've heard you right, this idea of putting someone else at the helm, so to speak, or identifying another aspect of yourself that's at the helm of this experience, that if there is a wounded child that's been in the captain seat, so to speak, that you can show up compassionately to that. But there might be someone else who can kind of take over captaining the ship, and what that experience would be like.
Yeah, like a compassionate observer kind of part or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. Thank you. Alistair, what would be a simple practice of inquiry for people who want to deepen their awareness or understanding of anger?
Sometimes I'll ask people, where did you learn about, who did you learn about anger from? And and sometimes it's a parent or some other person. And I'll say, so who did they learn that from? Right? Because we're not here to blame parents. We're here to understand how this shows up in our bodies and in our heads. And so we can go back multiple generations. And the more information we have, if I think in my own life, I think, well, between the ages of 7 and 12, my dad was living in Holland, where he grew up, and his dad was imprisoned by the Nazis. So he didn't have a dad. His country was, being run by Nazis, and they took their house away. Yeah, that might have had some impact,
Right.
among other things, right? It's like,
right.
What are the big events that had an impact on what led me to have the anger that I have? And then I can understand it, and I can pull it into a bigger picture, and without blaming anybody, just to seek more understanding.
Yeah, so I like that. So inquiring into who did I learn about anger from, and then also exploring generationally, even prior to that, what context in which that learning grew, or that understanding of anger grew, and how that may have been transmitted in those learnings about anger is an interesting.
Yeah, it gets passed down in our DNA. So there's lots of interesting research around that.
Yeah, that's compelling. Alejandra, you get the last mode of inquiry into anger.
I'm thinking a really quick one is the next time anger shows up at your door, you want to ask them, well, if you want to ask yourself, if anger was my friend, what are they trying to tell me? What is anger trying to tell me right now? That's one. And the second one, for the women that are listening to this podcast, maybe if you have a family where, or an upbringing where the people that were raised as women were angry, but they didn't speak up with words, like you didn't know, they didn't tell you they were angry, but maybe write a list of what were the body cues of those women, of those role models that might have shown to you that they were upset. Just to get in touch with the body cues or the language that they were using to express their probably internalized anger or resentment.
Yeah, I like that. How is anger language to me without the use of words, through expression, through physical gestures? I also very much like that first exercise of, what is this anger? If this anger was a good friend, what would it be inviting me to understand, or what would it be inviting me to see? That's a very empowering way of experiencing anger. Thank you for that. Thank you, all three of you. For those who are interested, I would invite you to explore more about Moes anger management. Would be one resource. Are there other resources that you'd want to share for people who are looking for therapeutic modalities, supportive modalities to explore their anger? Healing Anger is the other one, Alejandra?
Healing Anger is a program directed towards women.
Okay.
So
healinganger.ca.
Healinganger.ca. And does Moes Anger have its own?
Anger Man, like Superman, only anger.
Anger Man.
Angerman.online.
Is there a shirt that comes with that? Is it like a diamond with an A in it? No, there's none of that. There's no paraphernalia.
There's a cape and everything.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so those are great resources. So angerman.ca and healinganger.ca. Did I get that right? Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and we're on social media as Healing Anger or Moes Anger Management.
Tremendous. Thanks to all three of you for this. It's helpful, enlightening, revealing. So thank you.